Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tina Centris, and I will be your beginning moderator of this webinar. For those who have joined, we just want to let you know to use the Q&A feature if you have any questions, and we'll be moderating those at the end of the talk by my colleague Ashwathi. Today, we are very happy to welcome Shannon Hoste to give us a talk on human factors engineering and clinical decision support and software as a medical device. Today's talk will be recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording with everyone who registered after the webinar is done. I just want to give a quick intro to who Innovation Partnerships is. So we are the University of Michigan's innovation engine. We help support all researchers across all the 19 schools and colleges on campus. We have led to 53 startup companies that have been launched in the past 2 years. And one I'd like to kind of highlight today is Histosonics, which has recently been approved by the FDA for public consumption. So we're really proud of that startup, which happened this week. A little bit more about what Innovation Partnerships offers is we help in kind of 3 different bucket areas. We help with corporate research alliances, so connecting researchers with outside industry, as well as connecting outside industry and community partners with researchers. We help with licensing, so for those who have kind of come up with something during the course of their research, if they need to protect it and protect their intellectual property and license it to a third party, our office helps with that. And then the last bucket is ventures. So if someone wants to create a new startup on campus, we would help to kind of establish that and license University of Michigan intellectual property. The other thing that I'm very happy to share is that we have a new home for our software and content thought leadership series. So we have this website here that I'm sharing. The link is at the top. It's going to be a home for information on software and content on all things of open source, as well as protecting intellectual property. Our past recordings that were part of this webinar can be found there. And soon in the future, we hope to have it be an area where we can provide resources and templates and other kind of assets to help you in your research that are on these topics. So, stay tuned and keep your eyes peeled on this website. I think it's going to be a great resource in the coming months. With that, I would like to kind of hand it over to Shannon. Shannon is the Vice President of Human Factors by Agilis by Kymanox. She's also an assistant professor in the Quality Science Education Program at Pathway for Patient Health. And she's also active on several standards and conferences committees for medical devices and combination products. So I think she's going to share a wealth of knowledge today, and we're so grateful for her spending some time to share it with this webinar. So Shannon, I'm going to stop sharing and you can share.
All right.
Thank you.
Sounds good. And it's exciting to be here and to be part of it. So it's so encouraging to see all the work that is happening with this UM partnership. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this. And there we go. Is that working? Great. So we'll dive in. Everything, screen coming through okay? Okay. So just wanted to dive in. We're going to talk about specifically human factors engineering in software as a medical device, clinical decision support software, and we're going to dive in. I did want to give you a heads up. There's a lot of content on these slides, and I'll be going through a lot of different things. I tried to provide different reference links. So my goal is to go over this at a pretty high level, but provide other materials if anyone wants to dig in any deeper. So just to convey, it's my understanding I'm speaking with folks that are working in device development or working in research across the healthcare spectrum, and possibly some students as well. So I hope as we go through this, there's some nuggets of information that you find interesting and want to dig in a little bit further on. So I'll give you a real quick information about my background. I've been in the medical device and medical device development combination product field since the mid to late 90s. So a little over 25 years at this point. And worked in industry for about 20 years and then joined the FDA. the FDA. I ran the human factors team in CDRH, and also had some opportunities to work with DMEPA on the drug side as well. From there, I came back into industry and have moved into consulting at this time, and just working on with different medical device and drug manufacturers in their commercialization of products. So if we dive in, I think as I talk to a lot of folks across the country, across the world at different conferences and such, and I get a pretty unified message that we're all motivated by what we do because of the impact we can have for patients, the impact we can have on the people who are using the products. And I think it's pretty safe to say that we're all on this shared journey. And when I say we, I'm talking about folks that are working in learning to refine their specific area of expertise so they can bring that into the market. So the students, and then the folks working in the research, developing new technologies that can go into future products, or new understandings of physiology, so that we can apply new treatments. Folks commercializing products, the regulators. I see this across the spectrum. We're all on this journey and are motivated by bringing those products to the market, getting those into people's hands, and improving their lives. And so the question is, how do we do that, right? And so what we're going to unpack today is how we do that in a way that supports safe and effective use for the patients and care providers using our products. So real quick story on my background. So I started out in this field. My background is mechanical engineering. And so I was working on medical device products. I was very focused in on what was happening within that product, right? I had run, finite element analysis, or, it was long enough ago, some free body diagrams, right? And tolerance stacks, that were 30 steps long, going through the entire product to understand exactly how all of the parts within a product are interacting, and understanding how all of the materials are interacting. And so just getting down into all of the details of that device and how that device is working. What I started seeing were field failures that I could not tie to an engineering failure. And what I was understanding was it was cases where people were modifying the devices because maybe the injection forces were too high for them, or they weren't getting consistent forces, and they thought that meant they needed to modify the products. And so the feedback they were getting from the devices was causing them to use the product in a way not intended. And at the moment, a few years into my career, that kind of blew my mind as I was trying to write requirements documents and do risk management and understand how do I need to scope this product when people can do anything with it, right? So it wasn't long before I went back and I was exploring. Luckily, where I was at, I could walk across the street and start taking courses, and identified cognitive systems engineering, which was exactly what I was looking for. And what I found in cognitive systems engineering, or human factors, was a systematic way to think about not just what's going on inside that device, but taking those boundaries and stretching them out to include the users of that device. And then thinking through the interactions of that user and that product. So what cognitive systems and human factors is looking at is understanding what we know about human behavior, abilities, decision-making, memory, right? All of the things in the cognitive psychology fields, right, that we understand about humans, and then applying that to their interactions with technology, right? So this field has been around for quite a while, primarily in the safety critical systems space. So aviation, nuclear energy, and the like. Spaces where a failure is catastrophic, right? At the time, in the late 90s, the medical healthcare system, it wasn't necessarily on the radar for medical device development and so forth. And I think that's partially because it was piecemeal, right? And a failure or an adverse event happened, and it was one here, one there, one here. When you look at an aggregate, it was definitely catastrophic category, right? So we start looking at this and we start saying, okay, as we're developing medical products, how do we make them team players, right? How do we make it so our software as a device can be used by the intended users of the product, and they can do that effectively. So that's the focus of what we'll be talking about. And why is that important? So I mentioned, this field in the medical device sector has really been growing over the last 20 years, particularly the last 10 years. And that's because regulators, hospital systems, medical device manufacturers have started to notice that use-related risk often leads to preventable, or use-related errors leads to preventable events, right? And the regulators really have led the charge in driving the expectation for the understanding of human factors and use-related risk within medical device development. So we're going to unpack that a little bit here. So let me give you some examples real quick, just to kind of frame where I'm coming from. So some examples and maybe stories you have heard or you could look up. The first one I'm going to bring up, again, we're not looking at software here, but there's a reason for that. So let me show you this. Is the heparin example. So this is labeling on a heparin vial. And what was happening was these were labeled based on their concentration, not the amount of drug in the vial. And there were various formulations, some for pediatrics, some for adults, right? And what had happened was people in the moment made a mistake, used the wrong concentration. And we're talking about, like in this case, rather than a 1,000 units per milliliter, there's 10,000 units in this vial. So if you deliver the full vial, it's a 10 times overdose, right? And so, this was led to some just simple labeling updates that could more clearly explain what was in that vial. Other examples are misconnections. So if you're in a hospital system, patients may have, blood pressure cuffs, feeding tubes, IV lines, potentially access cannulas and the like, right? So there's all sorts of potential opportunities for error. And unfortunately, you were also capable of making these mistakes, right? These connectors would misconnect. And so after many, many, many incidences, this was being addressed, and there are now standards out for these small bore connectors where there are design standards so that they actually can't physically misconnect, right? So again, seeing an issue, identifying a way to address it, and implementing industry-wide solutions. Another example that I want to show you is infusion pumps. So infusion pumps have a lot of potential for error. They get more complex, right? Each of these examples has increased in complexity. But the issue I'm thinking of specifically with infusion pumps, this was in the late 90s, early noughts. And this was an issue with the way a lot of these pumps were designed. When you turned off the pump, it actually put the drug into a free flow state rather than stopping the flow of the drug. So events in a surgical theater, patient is not responding well. You need to rapidly change the medication up, stop the medication you're delivering, switch to another medication, reach over, you turn off the pump, start the other medication, thinking that stops that medication flow, but really it is now putting it in a free flow state. That is an example where what that user expected, how they expected that equipment to operate, didn't match how that equipment actually operated, right? And one of the basic tenets in cognitive systems is that people behave rationally in the moment. So when they're making these potential misconnections, when they're picking up the wrong vial concentration, when they're turning off the drug pump to turn off the drug flow, they're doing that based on the information they have. They're doing that based on all of the things going on around them. It's a rational decision at that moment. You can quickly realize potentially that it was an error, but given the information they had at that moment, it was rational. what we need to do as device manufacturers and designers is to understand how are we designing that equipment such that we can support those users in that moment. We need to know what they're experiencing and what is driving their decision making and understanding in that moment. And I wanted to give you these examples because, again, as I mentioned, they all increase in complexity. But what you see on a lot of these, and where a lot of errors happen, is in the information, right? So it's the information being conveyed by this labeling was being interpreted incorrectly, right? The information of where these connectors can go and how they can be connected was an error. The information provided by these pumps and how they work, meaning the information in the moment that user is receiving from that pump, could lead to an error. And so as we get more complex, as we move into software as a medical device, as we move into AI ML, that becomes even more complex and we need to be more deliberate as we think about that, because there is less information being presented on the system as we increase in complexity. So another example now, and this is a very data-rich example, and this is the example of the Therac 25, where radiation was delivered. There was a whole stack of issues in these events that were happening, and it was software problems. It was the system not operating the way the user intended. It was some procedural items that were coming up as the way they were evaluated. But this case was, a lot of evaluations were done on this case to understand what happened. And in the investigation, the evaluation quickly turned to the software. So in this case, there was a just a second, sorry. There was an aperture that should be closed, so it was doing an imaging and then a delivery of radiation. And so the arm that should have been attenuating and that radiation wasn't in place. And so it was quickly identified that part of the error was software, but also the computer kept crashing. And so what happened was the user that was programming it didn't realize that the updates they had made weren't getting saved. They were getting vague error messages, and so they weren't. The state of the system wasn't the same as the user had thought it was. And then when there was a chance to intervene, the opportunity for that person delivering the treatment to be monitoring the screen, they weren't, because of other situational events happening around them that they didn't see on the screen that was being delivered. And so at the end of this investigation, it was identified that the hospital system in this case, the specific case, was identified at fault, but as was the software, the equipment and the software. So the interesting thing about this case is that the information it builds for controlling risk within software development. And what I included here on some links, if you wanted to dig into this case, there's this article from New York Times, which actually created a lot of awareness of this case. But there was also the investigation case that was conducted 30 some years ago. This actually was happening in the 80s and 90s. And then there's a follow-up by that same researcher who explores, what did this original research tell us about how we manage risk in software? And 30 years later, where are we at? How well have we learned from this case, and how far have we come in development and understanding of risk with software? So 3 interesting articles that I captured there for you all. So we look at human factors. We look at human factors because we know that errors are happening. And if we go back in time to when, like I was talking about, this really started coming to the forefront in healthcare and medical device, was the IOM report in '99, right? So this was a report that evaluated and identified the prevalence of medical error, and was actually identifying that it's potentially the second leading cause of death in the United States was medical error, right? And so, as I mentioned earlier, this brings that to a catastrophic event type category. And what can we do about this? What can we do to design safety into the system? So moving on from there, you started seeing some development of national and international standards. You started to see some guidance coming out from the regulatory agencies, but it really wasn't until around 2010 when the FDA issued a draft guidance indicating that they could ask for human factors use safety data in their pre-market submissions. This is what really kind of started getting it on the radar for medical device and pharmaceutical companies. From there, in 2015 and 2016, the international guidance around human factors usability engineering was updated to be very safety focused. And in a month later, the guidance came out from the FDA around applying human factors to medical devices. And from there, you started to see more and more regulations. You've got the EU MDR, IVDR, who they really focus a lot on risk management and use-related safety. You saw other regulations coming out from UK, China, right? And the regulators really identifying that this is necessary and critical within device development. Other standards, such as 14971, the risk management standard, we're referencing back to the usability standard. And most recently, for our talk today, was updates around guidance from the digital health group within the FDA and within CDRH around specific application of different SaMD, AIML, clinical decision support, and then most recently, within the last month, physiological control loop systems. So let's unpack that a little bit. And I just want to give you some examples. So if we look at clinical decision support, and I actually at this point want to remind you, if you haven't, and you're interested in this and you haven't seen it yet, there was a presentation in the same UMIP series earlier this year. I believe it might have been March or April, on FDA regulation of clinical decision support and AIML by Pamela Forrest and Christiana Kuhn from Covington and Burling. It was an excellent overview of that regulation, and it dove into the clinical decision support guidance. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but if that's an area, definitely check that out if you haven't seen it. When we look at the clinical decision support guidance, what it is a guidance for is to help you determine if your software tool, that is a CDS tool, is a medical device or not. And so what it was providing were 4 criterion for what makes your product not a medical device. So it walks through, it's not intended to acquire, process, or analyze imaging or signals, right? It's solely intended to display or print medical information. It's intended to support recommendations, right, but not give specific recommendations. And finally, it's intended to enable HCPs to independently review the basis for those recommendations. So this is the one I want to focus in on. This is all about transparency, right? So what they're indicating is, if that product is providing, basically compiling information, and the reviewer can see everything that was compiled, what went into it, how decisions were being made, right? So it has full transparency. Then that, is more of a reference material, right, than a medical device. But once you start to build the algorithms and things to compile that information, and the user needs to be able to dive in and understand what went into the decision. What if there were missing variables? How does that impact the result? When is that algorithm brittle, right? When do they need to trust it? When can't they trust it? Once you start adding that in, that starts inducing risk and pushes it more into that medical device category, right? And they even mentioned that sometimes on the decisions, of whether this is true or not, whether that full transparency is there. Human factors and usability is a way to evaluate and understand if that's true or not. Another example, and this is again one more recent guidance that just came out, is the physiological control or closed loop control technologies. So what these are medical devices that automatically adjust or maintain physiologic variables through delivery or removal of energy or articles such as drugs, using feedback from physiologic sensors. So an example of this would be what's coined the artificial pancreas, right? The continuous glucose monitor that is providing closed loop system feedback to an insulin pump that is delivering insulin, right? So that is one example. There are many, many examples that, again, it may be drug delivery, it may not, maybe energy delivery. So what this indicates is PCLC technology can enable automation, this is straight from the standard or from the guidance, to deliver timely, accurate, and consistent therapy, reducing cognitive overload, minimizing human error, and enhancing medical care. Good stuff, right? This is great. This is using technology, research, advancement to improve how we can treat and manage conditions. Fabulous. And cognitive systems, coming from the cognitive systems background or the safety engineering background, this sets off all sorts of alarm bells in my mind when I read this. And the reason that is this is all true. However, when you start to introduce automation and are looking to minimize human error, you are potentially creating other risks as well that you need to manage and be aware of as you're doing that, right? And this is not just a medical automation in general has these considerations. It's all about, again, making the users and that automation a team player. So let's look at what the guidance has to say about that. So the PCLC guidance actually talks about so a couple things that they bring up. They bring up several, but I wanted to point out these. So they talk about automation bias. So this is a tendency for users to give greater belief to information from automation without verifying it. So if it says so, it is. They don't necessarily question it. Complacency is a phenomenon where the user of the system is now using less vigilance because they trust that system and they potentially trust it implicitly, and that can lead to not necessarily understanding the accuracy of the information. Fallback mode. This is an interesting one. So this is fallback mode is the mode of operation that the system falls back into when something goes wrong. So it could be a mechanical failure. It could be something where the system is stopped. There's a fault, right? So what mode does it go into at that state? And the example of that we talked about earlier was the infusion pumps, right? So the fallback mode, when you turn it off, the fallback mode in the system was to just go into a free flow. You need to be super clear that user understands what that fallback mode is, right? Because that misunderstanding led to a considerable misalignment in the way the system was performing versus what the user thought was happening. There's a loss of situational awareness. So this is a reduction in the user's awareness of the patient or the technology due to that automation of clinical decisions and executions by the device. And then over time, skill degradation, right? So this is a reduction in decision-making and execution ability that can lead to forgetting or skill decay on the clinical decision-making and that is being consistently executed by automation, right? So these are some of the concerns and potential risk areas that this guidance highlights. And I wanted to make sure we bring these up, whether you're working on PCLC systems or not. A lot of these are true for AI/ML, right? For other software specific systems, because there isn't quite that visibility into how that system is working, right? And so there are potentials for these types of hazards to occur in the use of those products. So the guidance goes on to establish, okay, how do you create safe and effective PCLC systems? It's starting off with risk management. You'll see this over and over again with regulators, with regulations. They're focusing in on risk. Everything is risk-based type decision. So they talk about patient risks. This is variability from one patient to another. How does that system deal with that? Device-related risks, so any faults or failure modes that might happen within that device itself. And then use-related hazards are focusing in on, what might happen with that user interaction. Can they intervene when they need to intervene? Do they know when they can trust it, when they can't, and the like. And so what they're talking about here, again, very systematic way to think through these things, is there a disturbance that is impacting, it could be impacting the patient in the way they're responding physiologically. It could be a disturbance in, I don't know, even connection, right? So if part of my closed loop system is a Bluetooth communication, and I turn that off or my battery dies on my cell phone, if it's going through that, what happens to the system in those situations? And then from there, understanding the risk, you move into device design, you move into verification and validation testing, non-clinical testing, and then they discuss human factors testing as well, and then labeling. And some of the interesting things they mention when they talk about human factors is specifically that your human factors testing should be designed to capture automation-related hazards, so complacency, automation bias, et cetera. And that if you're labeling in the instructions that the user needs to recognize an emergent unsafe situation and intervene, right? So when does that user need to be paying attention, and when do they not need to be paying attention? If you're relying on telling them that in your labeling, then you need to show that that's an adequate risk control measure. So they're really focusing in on the potential risks associated with a specific situation and automation, and understanding that our mitigations within our systems are safe for that. And again, I bring this up because this is the latest guidance that has come out in this area, and the guidances really give us an idea, an understanding of what the agency is currently thinking and looking at and focusing in on based on all that they're seeing in the market, and help us to understand, where we need to focus. So as we talk about regulatory compliance, again, I said risk management is the foundation to all of this. Risk management documentation is required for all regulated products. Human factors, as we're discussing it, is a part of risk management. It's understanding that use-related risk. Design controls, or in the quality system standard, it's called product realization, so the international standard, are required for medical device design and development manufacturing. And human factors is interwoven. It's a process, just like software development is a process, and it's interwoven, starting early in development and carrying through. And as you're compiling this information and you're preparing for regulatory submissions in the US, with a Class 2 device, you're looking at a 510K or de novo. So this is talked about in that previous webinar a little bit more in detail, but your 510K is assuming that there's a predicate device out there and you're going to compare yourself to that predicate. That predicate needs to have the same intended use. And then you are going to evaluate your product against it and say, okay, this product should be cleared as well on the market because it does not raise any new questions of safety or effectiveness. That's great if there's a predicate. If there's not a predicate and you're Class 2, then potentially you're in a de novo situation. And in the de novo situation, you're compiling data to support that your product is safe and effective. And then your product is becoming the predicate for future products, right? So they're creating a new product code and regulation for your type of product through the de novo pathway. And what that creates are, it identifies for that product type what are the controls required for that product. So it identifies the general controls, which are things like the design controls, and then any special controls that are required. So these are device specific, and all of this is captured then in the Federal Register. So special controls can be human factors usability requirements, can be hazard or traceability analysis, biocompatibility, right? All of the things that are required to be controlled and demonstrated for subsequent devices of that same type. Let me show you real quick what that looks like. So here's a few examples in the clinical decision support space for adjunctive predictive cardiovascular indicators. So this product code I mentioned are these 3-letter acronyms. And then what you see when you dig into these is, this is from the Federal Register. It identifies the product, the identification of that product, and then the classification. So in this case, special or class 2 with special controls. And then it identifies the special controls. So in this case, it's some documentation around the software and the software testing, as well as a justification of the predictive algorithm, and then human factors and usability, specifically around the risk of misinterpretation of the device output. So, so now if you're coming in and you're creating a product in this space, and this is now the predicate, you need to make sure you're addressing all of those special controls as well. So I wanted to share all of that because it shows how, as you're going through, as you look through the regulatory timeline, how this has evolved, right? Has it evolved from informational to guidance, guidance to regulation, right? And in your device types, you need to look at them and say, first of all, do I have a medical device? And then I need to understand what are the regulations specific to that device. And then you can start looking at what guidances and such apply to that device, guidance and standards. All right, so why do we want to do this? And other than we have to, in some cases, right? The regulators are asking for it. But the reason they're asking for it is because it's used to support safety and effectiveness and evaluation of that. And what they're looking for in that data is, and if you work in the software space, it's probably a similar logic to what you're used to. What they're looking for is that you're taking that product and you're evaluating it with representative users, and you're getting feedback on how well they use that product, and any issues that you see along the way, you're diving in, understanding why they occurred, and determining whether or not you need to do anything about it, right? Do I need to do risk mitigation? Do I need to address this issue? Why, from a manufacturing perspective, do you want to do it other than just compliance? It's also driving understanding of your product and understanding of your user groups. From the regulatory perspective, you could have a delay to market if you don't have all of the data compiled. But a bigger issue is once you're on the market, what are you going to see? I tend to think of this as a dry run of your post-market situation, right? You're taking your product, getting it in the hands of users, seeing how that product is used. You're either going to do it in development and address it, or your customers and clients are going to do it for you when the product is in the market, and you're going to hear back in terms of complaints and events. So I'm going to cruise through this. The slides will be available for folks afterwards, but just a quick highlight, HF is not UX. Human factors in this space, or usability engineering, are referring to the specific safety-based approach that I've been talking about today. And user experience is more broad. It's also looking at the utility, the ease of use, the efficiency, and all of these things are very important to the use of the product, and in some cases speak to compliance and safety. But the general lens from UX is more broad than the safety lens that we're coming at from HF. So in a nutshell, I'm going to jump forward to this one. What you're doing when you're doing human factors work is you're first starting with understanding your users, your use environments, right? That situation that I talked about earlier. breaking that down into tasks of use, identifying what could lead to hazards or risks, and then using that information to design and iterate through interface design, formative testing until you're ready to launch, and then go into validation. And so you're doing that, again, starting as early as you can to inform your concept and your requirements, moving through design and testing. So a quick example of that. So this came from a Stack Exchange discussion. And the question was, okay, what we're going to have a confirmation question. Which way do we color code it? Is it red, keep it, or is it red, delete it, right? And are people going to cue in on the colors more than the words? And the recommendation came back with, no, you need to rethink that and say, just either delete it or cancel this command. And so, this is a very specific example of a very specific UI element. But these are the questions that are going into the development of those interface features of what information is being conveyed, how are people interpreting it? And, heuristics can help, rules of thumb can help in designing that, but getting it in front of people can tell you a lot about that design. So some considerations and challenges. Again, as I mentioned earlier, first off, do you have a medical device? So there's all sorts of guidance on this. There's the presentation that we talked about. There's information published on the FDA website. And then there's all sorts of workshops and conferences where you have a chance to reach out and talk with regulatory experts and the like. You're going to want to keep an eye on changes in regulation. I provided a few links here for some different sites with guidance. So there's FDA guidance, EMA, and the Med Device Council released different guidances and so forth. So this is constantly changing, as you saw in the timeline. There's a constant evolution. So whether this is staying connected to all of this information or having a research partner or a commercialization partner that is doing this for you is critical to the life cycle of your product. You're going to want to make sure you're budgeting for this process and building it in as early as possible. So the earlier you start, the better. And it's going to inform your product. And it's going to help you in setting up your overall commercialization plan and schedule. It's going to help you define what funding you need and so forth as you're moving through. So make sure to factor this in early because it can be quite a surprise if you're getting to the point of regulatory submission and need validation data that you're not prepared for. That's all right. So benefits in the process, you've got reduced development intervals and cost. It's competitive differentiation, right? You're refining that product based on feedback in the field. Less liability exposure, less recalls, because again, you're doing that dry run, as I call it, before it gets into the market. And then ideally decreasing training costs and lower support costs. So it makes business sense as well. So I will open to questions and discussions at this point. I do have an example, but I want to see what questions we have first.
Thank you, Shannon.
Shannon, thanks so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was a really great presentation. And, I really liked the slide where you talked about how you got to where you are from being a mechanical engineer, because we have a lot of students attending. So we do have a few questions and I'll kind of read them out to you and you can answer. The first one is, what specific classes or topics would you recommend to learn more about HFE?
Oh, absolutely. So I took, the courses I took were through the cognitive systems engineering. So it was in the ISE program at the school that I went to. I won't mention it because it may be just a little bit south of you guys. So the cognitive psychology courses, the really understanding that human behavior opened up a lot of understanding about people using the products that we're trying to do. And other classes in ways to get to that information. So ways to do the research. So that's like the qualitative research, ethnography. So understanding, how to get in front of a user and interview them in a way to get a better understanding of what they're facing, things like that. So those are other areas that can help in the practice of it. And additionally, I'll just give a quick shout out here. If I'm going to flip forward here to my contacts information. I also teach with Pathway for Patient Health, which is a quality science education program that is free for university students. And it's a 3-course curriculum to dive into specifically medical device pharmaceutical industry and get a better understanding of different regulations and quality considerations within that. So if anybody's interested, they can check that out. I did do a look. I have had I have had students from University of Michigan. I know I had some folks in there from state, so I was going to challenge you guys to check it out from U of M as well. But I did see that there were some U of M students in there too. So.
Thank you. Another question we have is, when conducting usability studies, what are the things that we need to document to provide to the FDA later? And I'm assuming that this question is more from the research standpoint or kind of like pre-startup stage.
Yep, absolutely. So I'm going to actually go to this pyramid. This is kind of a pyramid of the human factors process and data that you're generating along the way. So it starts out, like I mentioned, by understanding your users and the use environment. So when you're in research, you are generating a lot of this information, not only about where your product's going to be used, what it's going to be used for, but also in general, how are you designing that product towards that solution, right? And so capturing that information up front here, if you're in the research phases, you're looking to move into commercialization in the future, having this information and having this documented is only going to help you then move into how do I now translate that into design input requirements for my product, right? How do I then test that to show that I've met those requirements and so forth? So capturing that information and documenting it in a way that it can be leveraged and utilized as a source of information for future product development is going to be super helpful. That information itself may not be, that record that you create in research may not go all the way into the design history file or the regulatory submission, but it can be a super valuable asset in informing those development documents that get created later on.
There's another question about the CDS example, and it's specifically about the transparency criterion. So someone's asking, there's a requirement for SaMD to be transparent. In many cases, we use very sophisticated AI ML methods and add transparency post hoc. Does that satisfy the 4th FDA criterion, or does the FDA really require the model to be so simple that the provider can write it on a piece of paper and calculate the output score by hand?
Yeah, it's a gray line. I don't know exactly where that line is drawn because the FDA answer is always it depends, right? But what I would advise is go back to the risk. So for that algorithm, for the purpose of that algorithm, what are the risks associated with use? So let's say there's 15 parameters being calculated. What happens if 2 of them are missing, for example, and aren't part of that calculation? If that could lead to a potential incorrect value or a misleading outcome, then what is being communicated around that? Right? Does the end user understand what variables need to go in and what happens if those are missing? And when they see the result, do they know that information is missing? So kind of when you're talking about what information is being conveyed, I would always take it back to risk and understanding when there are factors that could lead to risk and making sure that information is transparent to that end user. Now, where you cross that line to not satisfy criterion 4 is going to vary. So, the easiest case is, like you said, right? It's a dose calculator, right? That I could do on a worksheet, or I could have something calculated for me. That's the more easier extreme end of it. But as you start to increase in complexity from there, the best I can say is to tie it back to risk.
There's another question. This is more from like the student education perspective. Do you have any suggestions for a UX designer who wishes to transition into the HFE field? And does it make sense to, or would it be helpful to work in a medical company as a UX designer first in order to make the transition?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a good transition. The research methodologies are very similar, right? The getting in front of the user, understanding that user, getting information from them, those methods are very similar. The difference is going to be a little bit more on the focus. Are you doing that from a safety lens, or more of an experience lens, and the documentation? So I think my advice would be, one, to understand their standards and the guidances around human factors. There's several books with some documentation examples that have been published in the last few years that could be a good reference to kind of understand what is it that the HF specific data needs to convey. And you can get an understanding of that. You could do that by working as UX in a development firm and partner up with some of the the HF folks, right? Or the quality engineers a lot of times have responsibilities in this space, and supporting them in that. And I actually think if you're coming in from a UX perspective, you're probably helping them improve their methodologies for research as well. So it's really a win-win from that front.
Another question we have is, are there any useful frameworks that researchers can use or leverage in order to think about or factor in human factors engineering early on in their research projects? So I know you answered some of that in this slide, but are there frameworks that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think so. There are, I mentioned the standard. The standard's going to be very regulatory focused, safety focused, but there's a -1, it's IEC 62366-1 is the normative portion. There's a -2 that's the informative portion. That provides a lot. There's a lot of information in those two standards. There's the AAMI HE75 reference, which is quite an encyclopedia of human factors information, and amongst other references. And what those can help you do, and maybe I'll refer more to HE75 in this case, is it can help you identify potential heuristics, rules of thumb, that you can use to start as a starting point for what you're looking at for your product. Where do I start with button spacing on my GUI, or color contrast, or the like. It can provide some starting points there. It's super valuable, though, to get it out in front of users and get that feedback and understanding of what's working and what's not working. But it will provide an excellent starting place.
And you had a slide about, planning out your funding needs and budgeting kind of towards the end. Do you have any recommendations for how researchers can, plan for funding grants or their research budget to ensure that they're taking into account all the human factor engineering HFE needs?
Yeah, I think, and I'm going to show a slide here. It's from kind of a capabilities deck at my company, but I think it'll be a good explanation purpose here. This is a continuum of the kind of the research to implementation of a product. And what we've overlaid here are some of the human factors considerations in each stage. And so as you're thinking through this and identifying where you're at on the continuum of a research idea that you're then thinking about taking into commercialization, a lot of these activities in this in this space for this question will need to be addressed in some form or fashion. So understanding what the timeline is associated with that. These human factor studies, they're not quite as time consuming and costly as, say, a clinical study. But they aren't super quick either, right? You could be talking at 12 weeks to 40 weeks to get one of these studies executed, right? Depending on the scope of what that study needs to be. So making sure that you're identifying what those needs are, identifying a strategy, and planning that in for your schedule and for your budget. And this is a slide just from Kymanox, where we work to support as a commercialization vendor, but there are several commercialization partners out there and available. So plugging in and understanding where they can support you in this effort. Sometimes that means working with multiple commercialization partners in different areas of expertise, but making sure that this is factored in, not to use that word, but is considered in that timeline and schedule. So this is just an example for reference of different types of activities that need to happen in different phases.
Yeah, this is a really great slide. I think we have time for 2 more questions, maybe. So the next one is, obviously this presentation was, focused on medical devices, healthcare. Are there other applications where human factors engineering would be relevant? And can you speak a little bit to that? Because our office kind of serves the whole university.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's so definitely in anything that has safety related considerations, right? So funny story, sorry. Back when I first started in this field, I started investigating this by, like I said, just taking classes. So this was late 90s. And I started talking to different companies that I was working with. And I said, hey, this is one thing I'm researching. And I don't know that we focus enough on this in medical device development. I think here's some things we should think about. And I was coming from left field at the time, right? This was not on the radar. And so what I was getting was feedback of, well, we don't do that here. And I'm like, we don't design things that people use? That's weird. What do we do? Right? And so really, you have the UX lens of understanding users and the value that adds to the products. When you start having a safety aspect to that as well, that's where the human factors lens comes in helpful. I don't know if that helps answer that question.
No, that was great.
Another, actually, just one more quick story in the same journey. So when I left and I went to Intel, and they had a small group that was spinning up digital health technologies, they're a chip manufacturer, component manufacturer, but they were spinning up technologies for their next generation, and they were focusing in on healthcare delivery. So I went out there from the medical device sector, right? So I was entrenched in the medical device sector, went to Intel, and this group had probably a third of it was ethnographers and UX and researchers to understand the consumers and how they're interacting with the products. And it blew my mind. Again, at that time where in the medical device sector, they were asking, is this something we should do? To go to a component manufacturer, and they had this army of people understanding how people use the technology. So it was really interesting to see from the commercial standpoint. The commercial products have to embrace, the understanding and the delight of the user in order to maintain their competitiveness, and and how we're learning that as we go in this sector.
Yeah, very, very cool. Very relevant across so many different fields. We have one last question from the attendees. So I'm gonna try to paraphrase this. I believe they're asking about kind of like how does like the political landscape affect regulations related to HFE? And I'm not sure how easy it is to answer that question, but maybe like a follow-up to that would be like, what are upcoming regulations in this space that people should be aware of?
Yeah. I don't know politically of impact. I mean, I guess it depends on what you're thinking of when you say political, but I will say, having been in industry and then going to work for the federal government in the FDA, I had wondered about that going into the federal government, how that was going to factor in. But what I found was quite the opposite, actually. I found that the folks I was working with at the FDA were very mission driven. And the mission of the FDA is to improve public health, right? To make get products on the market, to speed innovation to market, and to make sure that people are getting the right information that they need. And that organization as a whole and the folks that I worked with in it were all very focused in on that, regardless of any of the political things going on the larger scale. So I actually found that very, very refreshing, and it was an excellent work experience from that standpoint of making that difference. Things that do affect when you start to see guidance and the way that, sometimes the agency has to reprioritize guidance. They publish a list every year of what they're focusing in on, kind of their A and B list. A lot of that will depend on current public health events, right? So when the hurricane in Puerto Rico a few years back caused some supply chain shortages, particularly around like saline bags and some other items. And so what you saw at that time was a lot of information being published about how to manage those risks, right? The duodenoscope event, superbugs, that whole issue that was happening a few years back, and the identification of that and the investigations that went along with that led to updated guidance on how we understand cleaning and reprocessing. That was all being driven by, current events and current public health care threats and the like. So I think you'll see that driving what's happening in the guidance more so than kind of the political winds.
Awesome. So we are 2 minutes over time. Shannon, thank you so much. We really appreciate you taking the time to do this presentation. For all of you that attended, my colleague Tina put this in the chat, but we will be sharing a recording of this webinar via email, and it'll be on our website. And we'll also include Shannon's contact details and the link to her class. Is there anything else, Tina?
There's just some stuff in the chat about specific factors for specific.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone. Thank you, Shannon.
Excellent. Thank you all for your time. Be here.